Well, thank you very much. And I want to also welcome everyone to this important session. We began this meeting this morning by basically in the first session looking at trauma itself and the landscape of study of trauma and how it had evolved over time to what we are. And in this session, we will go a little further than just understanding that particular landscape and trying to ground all of the knowledge we've had in that in the study of trauma into what we see and how it can be applied into personal and humanitarian types of works. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm a doctoral candidate in public policy school here in University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And we have three particular panelists here, which we are very, very lucky to have. We have Mr. Mohammad Al-Rajabi and Dr. Rana Dajani and Melanie Greenberg. In case I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, please pardon me. And Mr. Mohammad Rajabi is a facilitator for the field guide for Barefoot psychology. And we will begin with him giving us his pre-recorded opening remarks. Then we'll have the other two panelists also giving us their own remarks. Then from there, we'll go on with having some particular questions and engaging the rest of the audience. We encourage all of us to send in questions, to make comments, to engage as much as we can, and in our own different ways. We're all here to learn from each other and to establish better knowledge of what we have come to understand as trauma and its impact in our society. So I'll pass it on right now to Mr. Mohammad Al-Rajabi.
مرحبا، أنا محمد الرجبي من سوريا. بشتغل بالدليل الميداني للتثقيف النفسي مع مؤسسة كويستسكوب بدعم من بيوند كونفليكت. أنا حاليا بشتغل على المنصة الإلكترونية الدليل الميداني، اللي هي عبارة عن الدليل الميداني موجه اليوم على منصة إلكترونية لسهولة الوصول لأكبر عدد ممكن من الأشخاص ليستفيدوا من خدمات الصحة العقلية والنفسية. في فجوة بين الباحثين والأشخاص اللي عندهم الصدمة. أول شيء أعتقد إنه المصداقية كتير بتأثر. الأشخاص اللي عندهم صدمة بيكونوا أعتقد كمان قليلين كلام. ليش؟ لأنه ما بيشوفوا الحل كتير بالباحثين، يعني خاصة لما بيكون شخص بيجي لعندك بيقول لك أنا باحث، لأنه هو باحث يعني بالنهاية جاي يعمل البحث تبعه. لكن الشخص اللي عنده مثلا خلينا نحكي الصدمة فعليا، شو غاية المشاركة من معلوماته غير للباحث انه ياخذ معلومات مشان يفيد غيره؟ اذا شخص مصدوم ما حيكون عنده كتير حياة بين قوسين يحكي لك انا بدي افيد البشرية او بدي اعمل اي شيء، ما هو اصلا واعي بصدمة يعني. ودائما عم بيكون الباحثين اللي هو عم يدور حوالين الشخص المتعرض للصدمة بالضبط، مش عايش معه. ما عم بيكون خلينا نحكي الانسب اعتقد ما عم بيكون في جسر ثقة كتير كبير او قوي بين اللي عم بيعمل الابحاث عن الصدمة وبين الشخص اللي فعليا معرض للصدمة. كيف بناء هذا الجسر؟ يعني الشخص اللي عنده فعليا صدمة ما عم بيشوف في بالباحث اللي عم بيعمل الابحاث عن الصدمة اللي هو طوق النجاة خلينا نحكيها. هو عارف جاي يعمل بحث ويمشي، ما عم بيشوف بين ايديه العلاج. مو هو بده المارد اللي يحقق له كل احلامه، لكن ما كثير عم بيشوف في العلاج. انا اقتراحي الشخصي ورأيي المتواضع، الشخص اللي بده يعمل ابحاث عن الصدمه لازم قبل ما يعمل ابحاث عن الصدمه يبني جسر ثقه بينه وبين الاشخاص اللي عم بيعملوا الابحاث. كيف تعمل؟ هو بيستوعبك، هو بيحس معك، لكن ما في تبادل عواطف. يعني مين بده يبادلك بعاطفتك؟ قد ما شخص تعاطف معك، لكن مش مثل الشخص اللي بحس فيك. او انا هيك بعتقد مثلا الى حد ما، يعني انا ما اشخاص تعاطفت معي وبالصدمه اللي انا موجود فيها او اللي عشتها او اللي ممكن حدا غيري عم بيعيشها، الاثر علي غير الاثر على الشخص اللي عم بيسمع لي. طبعا اكيد انا اللي عم بعيش، انا اللي بوسط الدوامه وغيري عم بيشاهد. حتى لو تعاطف معك، حتى لو اجى لعندك وكذا، الغلط اعتقد انه او الشيء الصح لازم يكون مو تعاطف، ايد تمد. ايد تمت. حتى لو شخص معرض للصدمه صعب يتقبل اي شخص. في ناس كثير بتكون هيك منعزله خلينا نحكي، بده الايد نفسها تمد مره واثنين وثلاثه واربعه، هو اللي حيكون بحاجتها، لكن ممكن صعب ياخذها فورا. لازم يكون البحث مش بيوم او يومين، لازم يكون لفتره طويله. وقبل ما يبدا بحثه او يحكي لاي حدا هو ليش جاي اصلا، يبني جسر الثقه بينه وبين الشخص اللي جاي يشارك بالبحث قبل البحث بحد ذاته. انا كشخص ممكن اذكر له تجارب، يعني بذكر له تجارب الاشخاص لانه انا تعاملت كثير مع فئات شباب واشتغلت معهم، وبرايي انا اليوم اذا بدي اتصمم اي برنامج بحث على الصحه العقليه او النفسيه، نبلش من الفئه اليافعه، انه هي الفئه اللي بكره رح تربي اجيال خلينا نحكي. طبعا لا يعني انه بلش مع الشباب معناتها انا اترك الصغار والكبار، ما هيك بقصد انا، لكن اذا بدنا نبدا مع اولويه ناخذهم، نبلش مع فئه الشباب. فئه الشباب لانه هن بكره رح يصيروا ابهات وامهات ورح يربوا فئه عمريه، لانه هدول نحن اقل شيء بنضمن انه يطلع لنا جيل يكون خلينا نحكي صحته العقليه منيحه. هذا اهم شيء. كيف انا ممكن ساعده انه ممكن شاركه بتجارب شخصيه، لانه انا لا صرت بعد ما اشتغلت بهيك مجال اعتقد انه انا صرت مقدر بشكل اكبر موضوع الصحه العقليه. يعني صار عندي يقين بموضوع الصحه العقليه الى حد كتير كبير. انا كنت واحد من الناس اللي بسمع على الصحه العقليه مثلي مثل غيري، اوكي مجنون انا، يعني بدك يعني اقعد استرخي واحكي؟ لا، يعني لما فت بهذا الغمار عرفت انه في اشياء وفي اجزاء بالدماغ بتتضرر و فلما كمان هو الباحث بده يعمل بحث مع غيري، اول شيء لازم يبني جسور ثقه، لا يسالون اسئله مباشره، لانه فورا يا اما بده يجمل له كلماته ليرجيه انه هو شخص سليم 100% وتمام، او بده يصير الخيار الثاني ليرجيه انه هو شخص شديد المعاناه. وبالحالتين الباحث ما اخذ النتيجه اللي هو بده اياها. بناء جسر الثقه بخلي الشخص اللي بده يعمل معه البحث مثل رفيقه، ممكن يصير يحكي له اشياء اكثر خصوصيه اكثر، بيعرف بيعرف يكون عنده اريحيه بالحديث، بياخذ الاشياء اللي فعلا عن جد مفيده واللي ممكن تهم الباحث بموضوع الصحه العقليه. يعني اول شيء انا ممكن بعمله لازم صحح فكره المعلومه الصحه العقليه. اهم من ماده الصحه العقليه بشكل بنفسها. لنعرف احنا قديش اول شيء عم نشتغل بالصحه العقليه، لازم نعرف اهميه الصحه العقليه. اهميه الصحه العقليه لا تقل اهميه من اي مرض بيشكي منه الجسم. بالعكس، اعتقد انه هي الصحه العقليه ممكن تكون اخطر اذا كان عندنا فيها خلل بمنظومتها، لانه هي ما بتعطيك مؤشر مباشر. يعني لو انت وجعك اي عضو من اعضاء جسمك ففورا ممكن تحس فيه، لكن اذا عندك كان خلل بالمنظومه التفكيريه بسبب ازمات، ضغوطات، صدمات تعرضت لها، ما بتعطيك مؤشر مباشر. هي بتعطيك ما بتعطيك ممكن المؤشر الخطا بالوقت الخطا، ممكن تعطيك لحظات انفجار ما فيك تعرف انت متى ممكن تظهر عليك. فلو انا ممكن اغير شيء بالصحه العقليه، اول شيء لازم انا اعمله غير مفهوم الصحه العقليه. على الاقل شيء مش مفهوم كمسمى، مفهوم بعيون الناس كيف اشتغل عليه، على توعيه. اول شيء يعرفوا شو يعني صحه عقليه، اوصل للبشر بحيث ان هن لما بيطلبوا خدمات صحيه نفسيه يجي لعندي متقبل فكره انه هو ياخذ خدمات صحيه نفسيه. نحن بمجتمع الشرق الاوسط بشكل عام، يعني اغلبيتنا اي شيء بده صحه عقليه هو شخص مجنون. لازم نغير هذا المفهوم، هذا اول شيء. زيد زيد بشكل كتير كبير البرامج اللي بتشتغل على الصحه العقليه، البرامج الفعليه. كيف البرامج الفعليه والبرامج غير الفعليه؟ البرامج الفعليه هي اللي بتكون برامج مبنيه على اساس علمي. اما في برامج اليوم انا عم شوفها او شفتها باماكن مختلفه تحت اسماء مختلفه، ما بدي اذكر اي اسم او اي شيء، اللي هو موضوع انه انا اجي والله عم بعاني من ضغط او اي شيء، روح انا عند على اساس مرشد نفسي، اول شيء يلا عود استرخي واحكي لي. مش دائما الحلول بيعود استرخي واحكي لي. احيانا ما بيكون دائما العلاج للصحة العقلية الاسترخاء. ما معقول أنا واحد عنده مرحلة سبات وقاعد ومحبط وكابت وهو بالهايبو، يجي أنا كمان أعطيه استرخاء. فلازم الأشخاص كمان اللي بيزاولوا المهنة تبع الصحة العقلية يكونوا عن جد أشخاص مؤهلين، ويكون عندهم رحابة صدر أكثر من هيك وأوسع من هيك لحتى يعرفوا يتعاملوا مع أشياء بتخص الصحة العقلية.
Oh, thank you very much, Mohammad. That's a very, very passionate appeal, and you were able to really ground this experience for us. It's a very good way to begin this program. In summary, you talked about the lack of trust, where there should be a bridge between the researcher and the people who experience this trauma. And that especially for folks who typically experience this trauma, in most cases, they live in isolation. So they need, an environment where they can truly connect to someone. And that connection can only be, can only really help them and the researcher themselves if there's that level of trust in the relationship. And he also talked about that research in this space shouldn't be for the short term, but for a long term, because the consequences are not something you can easily isolate in one or in limited moments. But long-term engagement allows for building of that trust itself, but also allows to elicit all the important information necessary for both recovery and for help for both the individual and for the researcher. And I think one good thing also for me personally that you talked about was also the issue of trauma being intergenerational, and to even focus on young people when we talk about treating or addressing the case of trauma, because these people will become parents tomorrow. And if they become parents, how are they translating their social cues to their children, and whatever they do in that? We know people, kids or children are socialized within the family. And if you have parents who have traumatic experiences and that has shaped their realities, they may likely be able to translate that new reality to their children. So you can have an intergenerational impact if we don't really attend to young folks who will become parents tomorrow. And I think that was a very powerful thing you talked about. You also talked about, our collective understanding of mental health. And even though it's not just about the definition of it, but how public perceives this thing, and trying to change the public perception of what mental health is, so that people who go to seek for them are not considered crazy. And that ties into stigmatization of mental health. That is it's a very serious thing in the issue of addressing trauma. Not just understanding what it is, but really grounding it in the experiences where people can really be benefiting from the engagement of not just researchers, but health experts, and all of those trying to really help in the humanitarian space. So thank you very much for that very powerful and passionate opening remark. I will want to pass the baton to Rana, Dr. Rana Dajani. I'm sorry if I'm not calling him correctly. Please, you can go ahead and give us your remark.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a very important panel, and we are addressing issues that really need to be discussed openly. And I want to start my brief introductory remarks asking each one of the attendees to ask themselves, where are they coming from to this session, or even to this field? Are you coming in as a scientist, and why? Researcher, and why? Are you coming in as a practitioner, somebody who develops programs or delivers programs, and why? Are you part of that community that you're serving, or are you coming from an outside community to serve that community? These are very important questions we need to ask ourselves so that we can really move forward to answer the questions posed by this panel and this whole conference, or the whole sector for that matter. So I start with because it's confusing if you don't know where you're grounded as you go forward. So I ask myself that question, and the reason I'm going to answer you so that you can know where I'm coming from when I share how I look at the sector. First, I am half Palestinian, half Syrian. So I am a refugee on both sides and understand what's going on for both communities and both populations. And I'm from the culture, the language, the philosophy, the history. So that's one thing. That's the question to yourself. Who are you? Are you a Westerner coming in to help? Are you an Arab from that region? Were you ever a refugee? And I'm speaking about Arab because I'm speaking from where I am and what I'm undergoing. The second part is I'm a scientist. I'm a researcher. I'm a molecular biologist, and I study the impact of trauma on physiology and psychology and genetics. So I'm that scientist, but I also wear another hat. I'm a program developer, and I've developed a program to help alleviate mental health among refugees. So I kind of wear all these hats, and to find myself in the framework of how to go forward is a bit complicated. So keeping that in mind, this is what I want to share from my experience coming from these different tracts. First, that the words we use and the terminology and the concepts that we use when we describe trauma and how the impact of trauma is on humans is very limiting. And it comes from a Western perspective. When we talk about crisis, it means something that happens and then it goes away. Well, this morning, I was in a meeting with 5 female scientists from Palestine, from Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. And they were sharing with me what they are going through because we want to write an article in Nature about what's happening to them. This is not a one-time crisis. This is something that has been going on since 1948. So how do you study that? There's no terminology. We need to create the right terminology. And unless we are living it, we cannot even imagine the terminology. As my colleague Mohammad just said, if you don't live it, you can never comprehend it or even think you can. So the framework, the words, the whole comprehension of what happens to humans as they undergo the different types of trauma is very important to address. The second thing is that most of the research that we are using today and the tools and the designs and the approaches and theory are based in Western philosophy. They're not based in other cultures' philosophy. Yet most of the refugees are coming from cultures and philosophies that are Eastern, just for a better word. And so there's a disconnect there. And it is not about going to live in that culture or to spend time or to engage in conversations. And so if we really want to do good science, right? Science that, if we ask ourselves, why are we doing science? Really, it's to serve humanity, not to publish a paper. So we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. So if I want to do good science, this is what I need to do. I need to find, and when I say I'm saying the majority of the researchers are coming from the West. So as a Western scientist, I need to go and find the local scientist. Either that person is in the country or they may be in diaspora, to make an effort to find them because they know better the culture, the context, the language, the history. Why? To design better science, better research protocols, to create better tools. And that happened with us. We created a whole resilience tool that wasn't there, to analyze the data better because we understand what it means and we can explain it in context. And therefore to produce reports that have meaning, that can be utilized to develop better programming. Because it really addresses the reality on the ground. And these are the answers to what Mohammad Rajabi raised, those questions that he raised. Now, and not just that, because this local scientist is grounded, he can look and see new scientific questions that really have an application, that really can be used to advance humanity and doing, and creating better programming, better policies and so on. So it's not just you do better science, you're going forward in the future to create even more useful science. Now, the third point is most of the questions that comes from this Western perspective are always negative. How is trauma affecting you negatively? How is it increasing your stress? Rarely we find the question flipped to look at the positive. How is resilience built? And this is not to undermine the experience, but we need to look at both. And this new narrative is slowly coming out in the literature, and we need to be aware of it. Because when we started asking, how is the impact of trauma on grandmothers who are exposed to trauma be transmitted across generations to daughters and granddaughters, and could there be a resilience factor which is preserved evolutionary to keep them going? and to learn from that so we can understand our future generations and to develop better programming. Second, so involving the local community who I'm studying. Back to Mohammad Rajabi, he said, how do the scientists comes in and nobody trusts them? Well, yeah, because they're coming from another country culture. But when we were doing the research, I'm half Syrian, my mother's from Aleppo. I've been where they've been, I am them. It's not that I am helping, we are one. And so the whole community was there to say, what can we do? First, they had ownership because I tell them, listen, we're gonna study a program that's being implemented by an organization. We, the community, the served, and I hate the word beneficiaries, are ones who want to take control and see, does that program really work? And if it doesn't, how can we make it better? So this ownership is so important in agency. And so everybody was open. They wanted to do everything and help with everything. Third, we explained the science. Why did we want to take a hair sample? Well, it has cortisol, and cortisol reflects how anxious you are and because of the trauma that you're going through. So all the kids were like so excited. And the parents, and they were offering me like ways, how do we get the kids? Let's give them a free haircut. Let's give them a manicure because we're going to take a little blood sample because we want to see your immune system. So imagine the raising of the level of awareness about science that happened because of this trust, engagement, and sharing of information and being equal. Not that somebody is serving somebody or somebody knows more than anyone else. And then we went back after we did our research and shared our results. So these kids got to see the graphs showing how their cortisol went down, how not all things that the program claimed to improve were actually improved, that the program was designed from a Western perspective to boost resilience, and it didn't boost resilience. What we found is because the program that we were studying worked on an individual and didn't work on the community. And so now the program went back and said, oh, we have to redesign to make sure that we include the family and the community. So the kids had a say, which helped them boost their own resilience, have ownership, and be more positive, but also understand how science can serve them and to do better science and to create better policies that are driven by local people and local science. And I'm going to end here by talking about programming and policy. And most programs also that serve the beneficiaries are coming also from another culture, another perspective, and usually drawn on a page in a university very far away from the context of the refugee. And so, no, we need to involve the people themselves to design their own programs using the knowledge they gained from the research. They know better the reasons. And if they are designing it, they will make it in a way that is efficient, effective, and most importantly, sustainable because they own it. And there are examples. We Love Reading is an example of a program we started that is sustainable. It's carried out by the refugees as volunteers, and it's been going on for years. The Barefoot manual that Mohammad Rajabi is involved in is another example of local solutions driven by local people that are sustainable. And I will end here by saying one thing that we as scientists, unfortunately, ignore, although we're scientists and we should observe and analyze everything we observe and include it. And that's the issue of religion. Religion exists in every community, in every culture. Some people say it frankly, and some people don't, and put their head in the sand and say it doesn't exist. It does. We know nobody lives in a vacuum. And and I'm talking about my culture and my refugees. Religion is central in our everyday life. And if we mention religion, immediately everybody, and I'm going to say this frankly, it's like, oh, it's terrorism. No, it's not. This is what I do every day. So if I if I have a mental problem, I take the medicine and I take the thing. But if somebody tells me, oh, Rana, to help your mental, why don't you learn to dance Brazilian? No, I want to go pray. That gives me the same movements physically that I'm familiar with and comfortable with. So trying to understand what's happening in the culture and in context is very important. I'll end here and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very, very much. That's another perspective of really grounding our experiences of trauma. And yeah, so we will just quickly, I know there's so many questions coming in, and we'll get back to a lot of the things you're already talking about. But before then, we want to hear from Melanie Greenberg.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Rana and Mohammad, for such interesting and deep reflections. And special thanks to Biz and Justine and Cecilia and your whole team. It's been just such a delight to plan this. I've been looking forward to this for more than a year, so thank you. So I'm coming at this perspective not as a scientist, but as a peace builder and someone who supported the peace building field for decades. And one of the reasons I'm so drawn to this field is that there's a very permeable wall between science and research and practice. And as a practitioner, a deep hunger to understand new frameworks and new data so that our programming doesn't do harm. So it's really based on our best understanding, as both of you emphasized, on local culture, local understanding, so that our programs are helpful and not hurtful. Looking at the arc of peace building, I think it's very interesting to see that when I joined the field in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of emphasis on psychosocial healing. It was more at the level of dialogue. It didn't delve as deeply into the mechanics and the experiences of trauma, but it was very much a part of peace building. And I think as the field evolved, probably with the height in about 2011, there's an increased emphasis on institutions. Well, if we just get the institutions right, everything else will follow. And I think the pendulum has now swung back with the realization that no institutions can be built, no society can be rewoven until we deal with the interpersonal issues, the intrapersonal issues, and that trauma lies at the heart of the experience of everyone in peace building, that there is not a peace building context in the world where trauma doesn't exist. And so how we understand it, how we research it, how we develop programming, for me, is really the central part of the field. And I think what's especially fascinating right now is just the explosion and revolution in neuroscience, where we understand the literal effect of trauma on the brain, but we're also starting to understand what we sometimes call rewiring the brain for peace, how we build on resilience, how we can think about different ways of building responses to trauma. But in practice, I'm also seeing interest in the embodiment of trauma. How does trauma show up in the body? Are there rituals and practices that can help understand the embodiment and bring new understanding? And I think that's a place where the neuroscience and the cultural and spiritual practices come together. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, I ran a program with Beatrice Pulini, and I'm sure several of you who are on this call, called Rewiring the Brain for Peace, which brought together neuroscientists, peace builders, and spiritual leaders to talk about the understanding of peace, trauma, and sacred narratives in the brain, and to build a database of cultural practices, because in every culture, there are ways that people deal with trauma, that deal with healing, that really are often just understudied, and especially understudied as forms of resistance. And in doing that work, we found several challenges to research. I just like to give out some of those challenges so that the researchers, we can maybe think together about how to bridge them. The first, and both Rana and Mohammad got at this, is a definition of trauma and the words we use. And the trauma doesn't always show up as a person crying. Like, there are so many manifestations. It can be physical pain. It can be spiritual loss. It can be a drawing away from society. It can be an embrace of extremist narratives as a search for meaning. So first, I think there is a very cliched view of what trauma is, and we need a deeper understanding of how it shows up. In terms of the research, I completely agree with Mohammad that it can't be extractive. If you come and say, well, I'm going to take your hair and I'm going to take your blood and thank you very much, but it's not then fed back to the people who are giving of everything, and if it's not locally designed, that everyone has a stake, then it is extractive. And that is one of the key principles of peace building, that it be a collective enterprise and not a one-way extractive enterprise. I think what we experience with rewiring the brain for peace is that there often are cultural differences between scientists, peace builders, spiritual leaders that we often gloss over because we're all in the same enterprise. But if you think about timeframes, what does it mean to try to do research in time for a grant? But when you know that the effects of trauma last a lifetime. For the spiritual leaders we dealt with, we not only talked in lifetimes, but for our Buddhist spiritual leaders in multiple lifetimes. How do you talk about the experience between generations? Just lining up how you do the short-term work with the time frame of conflict and trauma itself is extremely challenging. We've run into real issues with human subject review at universities. And this is an example. This past year, one of our grantees who works in a conflict zone was denied human subjects approval because the university said, well, there will be no human subjects research during COVID. Well, the researchers were in place. They were doing an arts-based research program for victims of trauma in this particular country. So we had to scramble and find a nonprofit that could conduct the research, but the research wouldn't be published under the name of the university. In a way, I think there has to be a flexibility and a partnership where sometimes those frames, I think, can be very limiting, at least from a practitioner's perspective. We have to think about secondary trauma to researchers and to peacebuilding practitioners. I think this is an area that's better studied in the humanitarian and development fields, but in working with trauma, we might not have the same experience as someone who's lived through it, but it can be really traumatizing to listen to experiences, to bear witness, to show compassion. And how do we deal with that? How do we experience it so we can continue the work with our own resilience? And finally, how do we think about non-therapeutic models of trauma healing? I think there is often that Western cliche that will come into a room and someone tells you to relax, and that will be a therapy back and forth. What we actually are seeing, and these are some elements to focus on, are what are collective responses to trauma? For example, in Sierra Leone, a group called Fambultok starts with a reconciliation process where enemies across divides go through a local kind of cultural practice for reconciliation. But then immediately after that, and there's a whole process that leads to it, everyone has to join a collective of some kind, an agricultural collective, a women's collective, a youth group, because that trauma, there is not the sense that, well, you've been through this terrible experience, now you're cured because of reconciliation. But only by that collective action do you start not only to reknit the whole society, but you start to reknit the person. In the US, there's a fascinating group, Kazu Haga leads at Kingian Nonviolence Center in Oakland. And he's written a book called Healing Resistance, which talks about how engaging in social movements can create spaces for trauma healing and how to think about the links between social justice action and trauma healing. And finally, I think there needs to be more research on issues between justice and trauma, because there's a great research on justice and what it means to seek justice, but not the role that justice plays in healing trauma. Last night in my first pandemic dinner, post-pandemic dinner at a restaurant, I was very fortunate to meet with the former president of Croatia, a woman who lived through the war. And she said that she deals extensively with the survivors of sexual violence there. But because there has been no judicial process that creates a space for women to tell the story and for their perpetrators to be punished, they are continuously re-traumatized by seeing their violators walking around, that there's no distance. And so how do you link trauma with justice? So I'll stop there, but just an emphasis and a +1 to everyone who's talked about drawing on the indigenous practices, local practices, the partnerships, as we all are in this enterprise together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. You were able to bring the peace angle to it, which I think is also important. Like you said, there's no how, even though it's the entire human drive to seek peace, we can basically be able to achieve that if there's an internal peace. The heart of what disconnects the internal person from having peace is the issue of trauma. So we can talk about global peace without really addressing trauma. So thank you very much for that. And now we'll open up the session to questions and comments from people who want to have make comments, ask questions to our panelists here. I will begin. I think I have one that talks about, let's ask what are the practical ways that the voices of individuals with lived experiences of trauma can be included in research, in practice, in policy development. How can our organizations and researchers take actions to support this? That's one question to put out there. Anyone can go.
Could you, sorry, excuse me, but could you repeat the question? I'm a visual, so I couldn't catch.
Oh, sorry, okay. What are practical ways that the voices of individuals with lived experiences of trauma can be included in research, in practice, and policy development? How can organizations and researchers take actions to support this?
Yeah, I can start answering that. I think there's many, many ways, and I mentioned a few in my introductory remarks, but I can highlight one thing that I didn't talk about, which is language. And not the terms, but the actual language. Many times the person who has gone trauma has to speak with somebody who doesn't speak their language. And there's a translator, and the onus is not on the person who's listening to have the translator. It's sometimes the other way around. And so the importance of language, not just for the refugee or the person who's undergone trauma, but even the local people who are going to help carry out the research, the local practitioners who are rolling out, implementing, or developing a program. They're all speaking in English. I mean, all the conferences, everybody, all the international NGOs that go into to help, they're all speaking in English. And then they bring in one or two people on the table who don't speak English, so they have the translators, and rather than everybody should have the translators and this person speaking in his or her own language. I think, and that's not just for people to understand each other, but there's psychological streams there of feeling confident, of feeling in control, of feeling that I'm important and what I say is important. It's not just something that people will take into consideration. So I think that is something. And one call is that maybe we as funders, research councils, or international NGO meetings, as they invite more and more local people to speak, to have the local people speak in their own language and others have the translator on. And that should be like mandatory. And it makes also the scientist, the other person, or the funder walk in the shoes of the other person when you don't feel people are understanding what you're saying, when you can't get your point across properly and you're frustrated. So it helps, level that. So that's one very concrete way.
Very much. I don't know if there's any more comments on that question, or we can go to other questions. Okay, Melanie, you have.
I very much second, Rana, what you said about language. And we've really been trying in all the conferences we sponsor to really be mindful of that. I think that there are really good overlaps with how there's a shifting emphasis on local peace building in the peace building field, and saying, how do we who hold positions of power, privilege, money, start to change the narrative? So if I'm giving out a grant on trauma and the research is not really coming from a local level, do I say, well, I'm really going to favor a partner who does X, Y, and Z? Or same with a conference. So kind of using the ability that we have in creating the spaces to change the terms of who's being engaged.
And maybe just to add to your point, Melanie, thank you for bringing that up, is a lot of the projects, grants, and again, we're in a field where we're talking research, but we're also talking programming. So it's kind of, and usually the grants for research are different from the grants for programming, but in general, slowly this is changing to involve local academia, universities. To involve local in nonprofit organizations. Usually the ones involved in terms of nonprofit organizations are the big ones, right? And then they term themselves local by having a local office, but they're still international. So you're really not building capacity, and you're really not taking into consideration that these people will lead later for sustainability. And I want to throw something else in, is that even if you are an international NGO and you have a local branch, you call local, and you hire local people, there is a subtle culture and space that the local person does not want to show what she really or he really thinks, because they want to toe the line. They don't want to show that they're different. And this has happened again and again and again. So unless we give the ownership and the agency to those and give the funding to them, maybe help them build capacity, train, but let them be at the helm to lead. And this is basic. That if they don't lead it, then who are we, them, or whoever, to come have the right to come in and do it? And I just want to add another quick point. One thing we didn't bring up, and I don't know if it's going to come up in the questions, is that we're all talking about how can we help heal trauma, bring justice, and so on. But we have, and this is important, but we also have to address like the reason the trauma happened to start with. I mean, we're talking about what happened in Gaza last month and wanting to help. And then the US government just signed off of like, I don't know, 100 millions of arms deal to Israel of bombs. So, well, wait a minute, we're just trying to struggle to fix the war and then we sell more arms. So we need to be, we need to bring that up as well, not forget it, because that's the reason for all the trauma that's happening as well.
Great points, great points. And I think there's one question I'd like to also maybe pose to us, but particularly to Mohammad. The field guide uses storytelling, art, and accessible scientific explanation to explore various biological and psychosocial experiences associated with forced displacement. My question is, how much of this approach or the knowledge from it informs policy decisions that addresses mental health and social capital of displaced persons? Do I have to repeat the question?
Yeah, Peter, just repeat it slower so I can finish the translation accurately.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, the field guide uses storytelling arts and accessible scientific explanation to explore various biological and psychosocial experiences associated with forced displacements. My question, how much of this approach or the knowledge from it informs policy decision that addresses mental health and social capital of displaced persons?
Hi, everyone. With me, Mike and Mike Nikichok, because it helped me because translate. رح أحكي عربي هلا حاليا. دليل الميداني استخدم شيء مختلف عن البرامج الثانية، مش لأنه أنا بشتغل فيه، هذا حقيقة واقعية.
The field guide used a different approach that's kind of different from what I had seen and experienced in other psychosocial programs.
اللي هو ما إجا عن طريق البحث وحكى لأي شخص معرض للصدمة، عمل دورات مفتوحة للجميع من فئة عمرية معينة.
It wasn't so much that a researcher or someone developed it and came to the camp and suggested that it be implemented for a specific age range in a specific group.
وما حكى لأي شخص تعال احكي لي قصتك.
And importantly, it didn't encourage anyone, it didn't tell anyone, come tell me your story or come tell me what happened to you.
هو اللي حكى القصة.
The field guide, by using storytelling, told the story so that people didn't have to relive that.
وربط القصة بتفاصيلها بالأشياء العلمية.
And it sort of took the burden of linking the collective experiences with an explanation of what's happening biologically in a lot of people after trauma.
فصار هون الموضوع في تشجيع للأشخاص المشاركين بالدليل الميداني إنه هن يحكوا الستوري تبعهم، نعرف شو اللي عم بيصير معهم.
So that's a way of reducing the barrier that makes people often uncomfortable in even reliving or talking about or discussing traumatic experiences, because the story was already there, told.
حتى التمارين التهدئة الذاتية اللي استخدمناها بالدليل الميداني.
Even the self-care exercises that we use in the field guide approach
كانت مربوطة بمعلومات علمية.
Were also linked directly to the psychoeducation content that's taught through the stories.
لأول مرة بتعمل تمارين بتلاقي الموضوع فاني مضحك شوي.
So maybe the first time people do these exercises, it's funny or comical because it's unfamiliar.
لكن بعدين بيحس المشارك بقيمة التمرين اللي هو عم بيعمله.
But because of the explanation, with time, participants feel that it makes sense. They understand why I'm doing this.
والدراسات اللي انعملت على الدليل الميداني مش كانت بس فقط عن أسئلة وأجوبة، كان فيها أجهزة فيزيولوجية.
And importantly, the research that was done about the use of the field guide didn't just include self-report data. It also included measures of physiology.
هذا السبب اللي خلاه شوي مختلف عن باقي البرامج الموجودة للدعم النفسي.
And this type of approach makes it slightly different than what's usually brought out and researched.
اللي أنا شاركته بقصتي أولاً، لحتى هو حكى لي شوي عن قصته، ولحاله اختياري ما كان الموضوع ما كان في أي activity أو نشاط بيجبر المشارك إنه يحكي عن أي شيء عن نفسه.
What makes it so different from a lot of other programs that are used in similar contexts and sort of rolled out is that there's no burden of responsibility on a participant to ever say what happened to them, because that's not something that's comfortable for a lot of folks.
That's it.
That's all I have to say about that.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And okay, I have one question, I think from Susan, and the question is directed to Melanie. And Melanie and others, okay? What do we do when justice is unattainable? How do we engage communities in healing? Under some circumstances, a preoccupation with seeking justice may embitter people and does not lead to healing.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that question, which I think lies at the very heart of peace building. And I feel like you can't, and there was a response to this question in the chat, which I thought from Fong, which I thought was very helpful, is you cannot give up on justice. Justice is absolutely elemental and essential. And if you don't focus on justice, I'm reminded of the psychiatrists in World War I who would bring the soldiers back from the battlefield who had what they called shell shock then, and get them just like well enough to go back into the battle. And that's not what we're trying to do with trauma healing. So you have to think about a whole ecosystem where you're supporting people who are fighting for trauma. And for those who aren't in the day-to-day fight, supporting their own healing from conflict. But I really feel there's no way you can uncouple the search for justice from the experience of living in injustice, from healing. Because if you heal, you can learn to survive in a situation that's unjust. And we've seen people do that for decades and generations. And yet our goal should not be only to focus on that and not in the larger context. So I'm not sure that's a very helpful answer, but just I found my own almost physical reaction of thinking about the separation really strong.
Thank you very much. Is there any addition to that? Or we go to the next question. Great. We have another one that really is something similar to what we had asked before, but there's more emphasis on the policy angle to it. And it says, how can policy be improved by taking into consideration the current research on the effects of trauma for violence survivors? How can policy be improved?
I mean, I'll just come in general. I'm not the expert on policy. I'll just give my general response on this. When you talk about policy, which country are you talking? Are we talking about like the more stable countries who are offering aid so that they could change their policies? That's one, which I'm not going to answer because that's not my field. Or are we talking about policies of the countries who have actually been either the perpetrators of this violence or the receivers, the host of the survivors of the violence? And unfortunately, most of the countries that are either part of the where the trauma happened, or the neighboring countries themselves are struggling with their own struggles, being developing countries, for lack of a better word. And so they have their own policies for their host communities trying to deal with that as well. So it's really complicated as a question. It's not simple and straightforward. But one guiding, let's say, beacon to strive for is again, to make sure that any research is in the local language of that country. So for example, in Jordan, which is a host for many refugees along the years, from Palestine, from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen, from Sudan, Somalia, everywhere. If we're gonna change policies in Jordan, and Jordan has been great in its hospitality and taking care, but nobody's perfect. The research is in English and the government people and the policymakers are speaking Arabic, right? And they're not going to go translate these. So if the researchers and the people who want to do good, they need to make sure that these are translated into the local language so that they can be really taken up by the people. And that's one thing. The other thing is to show how the benefit is for everybody. It's not just for those trauma survivors or those refugees. If they feel better and heal, the whole community will heal, because we live together. We're humans. We're social community. So to showcase how if everybody, they are the weakest link. And so if they're not good, nobody's good.
Great, yeah, great. And yeah, so thanks for that. I think I have one more that's from Sarah. And Sarah said, what we see today, graduate programs, at least in political science, rarely trains students for working in traumatized societies and with traumatized people. In fact, good political science is often defined as maintaining distance from the researcher's own emotions and experiences, including their own trauma. Do you have suggestions for training and practices that would help outside academic researchers do a better job at building trust and building local-based projects?
I'm happy to jump in as a consumer, again, of science, but also someone who hires and works with a number of graduate students. You know, I think just as in the Peacebuilding graduate programs, we learn quantitative methods, that those who are in political science and fields where there is that expectation, perhaps of distance, that they'd be required to do field research. Is not just the research, but some local piece, like actual peace building. I mean, it is a skill that can be taught of how do you build trust? How do you build bridges? How do you concentrate on local agency and power? How do you manage your own emotions? And I think if that were part of graduate programs, we'd have, you know, at least start to build those bridges.
I can follow up on Melanie, and actually one of the questions is a follow up to that. Like, how do you engage with the local people, the local community? How do you build that trust? I think Trisha also kind of follows up on the same issue. Again, it's you as a researcher, and I'm wearing the researcher hat now. You need to go find those researchers. You need to go knock their doors. I mean, if you really, truly, sincerely care, you need to go find them and engage them. Yes, language is going to be a barrier because most of the people, the scientists and scholars in the Arab world who work on mental health have their degrees from Arab countries, not from Western speaking countries. So the majority of social sciences, mental health is all in Arabic. So you need to engage with them. You need to be patient because in the end, that's your, I mean, if you really want to help, right, and be sincere, and that's for sustainability on the long run. So that's number one. Number two, if you're not a researcher and scientist, you're looking for programming. You need to go find those. If you have a local branch from an international NGO, tell them, no, I don't want to work with you because you have the funding, you have the money. So you have some leverage. Tell them, no, I want to work with a local NGO. Find me a local NGO. They are there. It's just that, again, the language barrier, the accessibility, they don't know. So the onus is on the people coming in with the money and the intent to find those people and look for them and get them out. Yes, as again, they're not perfect. They're going to have a lot of, but that's part of the job, is to help them build their capacity and open a door for them. And on the flip side, there are local NGOs that try to approach and apply, but they are considered, or when they are assessed in a grant application or a funding mechanism, they're assessed same as an international NGO. So sorry, you're not good enough and you're always going to lose. So yes, there should be some leeway that if you're a local NGO and registered as a local NGO, you either get extra points or you get some training or there's a special grant for you to raise you up to that level. Otherwise, you're never going to win. So also creating the conditions that allow people to be able to compete in that. For researchers, have the application be in Arabic, not always in English. Because otherwise a scientist in Jordan is not going to be able to write an NIH grant in in English, that's competitive. She may have the best idea in the world and the best scientist, but she doesn't. So have those and find people. There are people who can help translate and to do things. It's the extra mile, but on the long run, it's going to pay off. Another thing is part of the building capacity is reaching out to the community, right? And so when you talk to them and explain the science, scientists usually, they don't explain the science to the everyday person. They think, oh, they don't know. They're not going to understand. No, they will understand. These are smart people. These are human beings. The IQ around the world is distributed on a normal spectrum. So you're going to find people everywhere who are going to understand your science. So make it simple. Work on your science communication skills, explain it, and then everybody's going to be on board. And you'll be having a double bonus of raising awareness to science and the level of science among this population that will help you, again, on the long run. So in a way, it's also selfish because they're going to help you because they know what's happening and they can promote the learnings and make it better. So these are some ways, how you can engage with the community, find them. And again, if you can't find a local researcher, there's plenty in diaspora. You'll find them in the US, in a university, or as a refugee in exile, but you have to search for them and be patient. And that's part of the work. And maybe I'm thinking now as I speak, maybe this should be this component of searching for, creating the link. Maybe this should has its own funding, its own discipline, not just jumping from I'm the scientist and then I'm going to do the research, but that bridge, I think that bridge must be identified as a pillar, addressed, should have its own training, its own funding to make it happen.
Thank you so much. There have been a lot of questions and a lot of good comments and answers and responses here so far. We are almost getting towards the end of our conversation. And I really want to thank everyone for being here and participating and sharing ideas and knowledge. For panelists, I will want us to just give some kind of concluding remark for about a minute, each one of you, and then see what we have to say as we're about to wrap up this particular session. I want to begin with Rana, since you're already on my screen.
I thought I was going to break to reflect. Okay,
just a minute, yeah.
No, I'll just end by saying I believe every human being's DNA is different from anybody else. And therefore, that's an advantage that you come fresh into this world with a new perspective. And so have trust in yourself to make a difference and be sincere. And we can make a difference, all of us together, if we stand up and say what's true and seek that human relationship with the people around us to make a difference and respect others, even if we disagree, to understand that they're coming from a place that's different from mine, and there's a reason that they think this way and talk this way. So have that, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Yeah, and a shout out for those who are not the researchers and the scientists. If we have other people who are on the receiving end of all this, who are listening, we need to hear your stories, write your stories, because without them, the world will not know what's happening. So, and thank you very much.
So I'd like to allow Melanie to go and give us a final remark too.
Good. Thank you. Well, first is a thank you from the peacebuilding community to the scientists. And in a world where increasingly, I think we are seeing a lack of respect for science or a rise in disinformation, the people who've really dedicated their lives to building that, I think we need to champion in every way that we can. And I think one of the major themes that emerged out of this panel is how do we bridge the distance? How to ensure that we can be objective, but we can be engaged. We can get outside of our frame. We can engage with people who feel very foreign and respect that and actually build on their knowledge. And that is the basis which all else comes. And I find those really inspiring thoughts. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. And last but not the least, Mr. Mohammad.
شكرا على المؤتمر الحلو.
Thank you for the invite.
أنا بس برجع بأكد على تقريبا نفس شبه متشاطرين بالفكرة أنا والدكتور رنا.
I just want to go back and really highlight something that Dr. Rana and I have been talking about.
برأي أي باحث بده يعمل أي بحث جديد إن كان داخل مخيمات أو مجتمعات مستضيفة.
Any researcher that's investigating any issue, whether it's in a refugee camp or among refugee host communities, for anyone that's been exposed to trauma,
يأكد على موضوع جسر الثقة.
To really focus on that idea of what does trust look like.
وكون على ثقة تامة إنه شخص معرض لصدمة ما حيجي يحكي عن تجربته أو صدمته لأي شخص يشوفه لأول مرة أو مبني على أسئلة ويجاوبوا عليها.
No matter what questions are asked or no matter what, a person who's been exposed to trauma is in no way, shape or form going to just open up and tell their story and talk about what's happened to them in an accurate way in one interaction.
فلازم يكون في جلسات طويلة أو برامج مخصصة لهيك شيء يتعايش معه يعيش معه لفترة ممكن بأي مكان الشخص المعرض فيه.
Imagine a type of program where a researcher is forced to live the same life as a person who's been exposed to constant trauma for an extended period of time, and how would that change their research?
موضوع اللغة اللي حكت الدكتور رنا كمان كتير مهم.
The idea of language is also critical.
وموضوع النتيجة ما بعد المشاركة.
And the idea of what happens next after I'm researched.
يعني لما بشوف الشخص اللي معرض لصدمة لنتيجة الكلام اللي هو حكاه، مش شرط 100%، لكن بشوف في صار شيء ملموس، إذا مو مشانه، مشان اللي حواليه، مشان أسرته، مشان عائلته، مشان رفيقه، مشان زميله، كتير رح يشجع غيره إنه يشارك التجربة تبعه.
It's not so much about the benefit for the individual subject being researched, but the person that's being researched wants to see and has to see, to encourage others to participate in similar things in the future, some benefit, not necessarily for him or herself, but at least for others in the community. Because without any tangible benefit, people aren't going to stop wanting to participate in these types of things.
And finally, thank you, Mike Nikonchuk, because translate. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists. I want to especially thank you, Mohammad, Al-Rajabi. You spoke with so much passion. It really connects with experiences of a lot of the people who we work with. And I really appreciate your comments and your insights and your angle to what you have brought to the conversation. And also I want to thank Dr. Dajani. It's wonderful to hear you again, to talk from the kinds of perspective and the different hats that you put on and in the different things that you do. It's wonderful to hear all the different perspectives that you also bring. And in a special way, also thank Melanie Greenberg, come from a peace perspective and understanding that the global peace that the world seeks is also can only truly be achieved if there's an internal peace and interpersonal peace. It's beautiful to hear all of these different perspectives come to really reinforce why what we do is so important. And beyond just important, it tells that, from where we started the program this morning, we're looking at the landscape of what we know trauma to be, to the kind of conversation we're having now, the tangibleness of trauma in the work that we do and in the lives of the people we impact upon, and allowing this conversation to continue beyond today, even to tomorrow. I want to encourage all of us who are here to keep up, and be part of the future conversations, and really thank the rest of us who are participating today in this session to keep and continue to engage in our conversations beyond now. We will end this session now, and also finally want to thank the organizers, Justin, Liz, and the others, I can't remember their name. It's a privilege for me to be here, to hear from you all, to be part of this program, to learn from you. I've learned so much. I'm inspired, and I believe all others, or the rest of us who are part of this conversation in one way or the other, is also inspired and felt have something to take home with. Thank you very much, and this will be the end of this session.